Good morning, everyone. It's great to see such a strong turnout for this event on the first chilly morning of our academic year. Welcome. I'm Joel Hellman. I'm Dean of the School of Foreign Service, and it is really our pleasure to be hosting this event today. We were all shocked by the assassination of Prime Minister Abe and mourn with the people of Japan and people around the world who recognize the extraordinary role that Prime Minister Abe played, not only as Mike Green often says, as the most consequential leader in modern Japanese history, but also, as this conference will show, as an important force in the Indo-Pacific region more broadly. In this school in particular, the oldest school of international affairs in the United States, which is dedicated to thinking about and developing new leadership to transform the world, we celebrate the legacy of individuals like Prime Minister Abe, who's had such an extraordinary role in his own country and around the world. And in fact, we are reminded here only just a few weeks ago, celebrating the legacy of another critical and iconic figure in global affairs, Madeleine Albright, to know that this school spends time to really engage, understand, and further elaborate on the legacy of critical individuals who've had such an important role in history. And that's why I'm so glad to be hosting this today. I also want to mention, because we are so pleased with the relationship that we've had with the government of Japan, the investments that we've made in understanding Japan and Japan's role in the history and current politics of the region. And we're so very pleased that Japan has, since even going back as far back as the 1970s, had this very strong history of supporting foreign institutions in the U.S. and Canada, the United States, France, Germany, with building Japan studies programs. And we have been honored to be a recipient of that support. In 2015, Georgetown received a generous gift of $5 million from the government of Japan to establish the endowed chair in modern and contemporary Japanese politics and foreign policy here at the SFS. And I want to thank the government of Japan for establishing that chair and acknowledge that that gift itself was established under the Abe government. So his influence obviously impacted what we do here. The purpose of the chair and creating the chair was to do, indeed, in keeping with our legacy, to prepare the next generation of U.S.-based scholars and practitioners who would be focused on academia, the private sector, the public sector in Japan. And that chair was inaugurated in 2016. Dr. Michael Green, who you're going to hear from today virtually, was appointed at that as the first chair, and it was a great opportunity for me as my first year in Dean when we were able to do that. And of course, the Asian Studies program as a whole at Georgetown has had a very close and fruitful engagement with the Embassy of Japan. In May, we were honored to host a breakfast with our own alumnus, a former Foreign Minister Kono Taro, and the Asian Studies program celebrated its graduation, in fact, at the residence of the Japanese ambassador. So we are so grateful for the support of the government of Japan, and we are so grateful today to have Ambassador Tomita here to join us for this very important discussion, of course. So let me wish you an engaging discussion on the legacy. Let's hope that we learn lessons of leadership and transformative leadership that Prime Minister Abe has shown to Japan and to the rest of the world, and that we continue to engage in the critical aspects of that legacy for our future in a very uncertain time. So with that, let me turn over the microphone to Dr. Yuhki Tajima. He's our director of the Asian Studies program, and he'll speak a little bit more about today's event and introduce our speakers. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dean Hellman. And thank you to Ambassador Tomita for your presence today and your steadfast support for the Asian Studies program and the Japan Chair, which is supporting today's event. We are honored to have you here and really eager to hear your insights and reflections today. Once again, we offer our condolences to the people of Japan over the tragic killing of Prime Minister Abe Shinzo. And thank you to Dean Cha and Professor Smith, as well as Professor Green, who has recorded his reflections from Australia for today's event. And of course, thank you to Kelly Liu for organizing this event and Robert Lyons for your support. When Prime Minister Abe Shinzo was assassinated on July 8th, as he was campaigning for the upcoming elections, it sent shockwaves throughout the world, not only because it was an attack on the peaceful expression of democracy, but because of his stature in international affairs. Even before his death, he was already viewed as one of Japan's most consequential prime ministers, as Dean Hellman just mentioned, as the progenitor of the notion that democracies that line the Indian and Pacific Oceans could promote an arc of freedom and prosperity that eventually became coined by Prime Minister Abe as the free and open Indo-Pacific. This then became the basis for the establishment of the Quad, promoting a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. These concepts, as articulated by Prime Minister Abe, have since been adopted as a shared vision by the U.S., its allies, and many countries in the Indo-Pacific. These concepts have become ever more important with the threats not only in the Indo-Pacific, but for peace and order globally. At Georgetown, and in particular the Asian Studies program in the School of Foreign Service, the tragedy was felt especially poignantly because a number of our faculty had worked with him directly to strengthen U.S.-Japan relations. Moreover, he had been very supportive of our program through the establishment of the Japan Chair, which was endowed by the Japanese government while he was prime minister as a means of fostering U.S.-Japan relations. Thus, in commemoration of his contributions to promoting U.S.-Japan relations and his support for our program, the Asian Studies program is pleased to announce the annual Abe Lecture on U.S.-Japan relations, which will be supported by the Japan Chair in Modern and Contemporary Japanese and Foreign Policy, for which this is the inaugural event. This would not be possible without the support of the Japanese government. So thank you very much, Ambassador. With that, I'd like to invite our panelists to the stage. So we'll begin with the ambassador. His Excellency Tomita Koji is Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of Japan to the United States. Ambassador Tomita's diplomatic career in the Japanese foreign policy spans 40 years, in which he has served previously as Japan's ambassador to Korea, Prime Minister Abe's personal representative to the G20 summit in Osaka, and ambassador to Israel in addition to other postings in London and Paris. Aside from his overseas duties, his primary professional focus has been on security policy, being actively involved in policy and legislative reviews of the Japanese government. Ambassador Tomita spent a year in college studying in North Carolina and has since been engaged throughout his career in various leadership positions focusing on U.S.-Japan relations, including as Director General of the Foreign Ministry's North American Affairs Bureau and Deputy Chief of Mission at the embassy here in Washington. Somehow, through this very busy career, he has also managed to publish 2 books on Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher, the latter of which won the Yamamoto Shichihei Award. Professor Michael Green, who we'll hear from virtually, is Chief Executive Officer at the United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney and is on leave from Georgetown, where he is Professor and Japan Chair in Modern and Contemporary Japanese and Foreign Policy. Professor Green has served as Senior Director for Asia on the National Security Council and is the author of Line of Advantage, Japan's Grand Strategy in the Era of Abe Shinzo, as well as By More Than Providence, Grand Strategy and American Power in the Asia-Pacific since 1783. Dean Victor Cha is Vice Dean for Faculty and Graduate Affairs, as well as Professor and Daesung Korea Foundation Chair in Government and International Affairs. He is also senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and previously, Dean Cha also served as Director for Asian Affairs in the National Security Council. He is author of Power Play, Origins of the American Alliance System in Asia, and The Impossible State, North Korea Past and Future. And finally, Professor Sheila Smith is John E. Marrow Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. She's also an adjunct professor here at Georgetown and the author of Japan Rearmed, as well as Japan's New Politics and the U.S. Japan Alliance. She also serves as chair of the Japan-U.S. Friendship Commission and the U.S. Japan Conference on Cultural and Educational Interchange. The panelists will now offer their reflections on Abe Shinzo's legacy in the Indo-Pacific, after which we will open up the floor for Q&A. We will begin with Ambassador Tomita, followed by a presentation by Professor Green, Dean Cha, and Professor Smith. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Tomita.
Well, thank you very much, Tajima-san, for that introduction. And I thank Georgetown University for doing this event and also for launching Abe Lecture. The assassination of Abe-san was a great shock to me, but an outpouring of sympathy and condolences expressed here in the United States has been, I've been overwhelmed. And I thank American friends for being a great support at the time of difficulty. And, I got to know Abe-san when he was Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary. This was back in 2001 during the Koizumi years. And since then, I had the privilege of working with him in various capacities and circumstances. So it's really difficult to condense my thoughts into 10 minutes remarks. And I think Mike, Sheila, and Victor will be talking about his legacy in a more substantive way. So let me concentrate on his personality, pointing to some of the characteristics which I think made him such an effective international leader. The first characteristic I like to point to is that he was a great engager. During his second premiership, which lasted 7 years and 8 months, he made 81 foreign trips, which is almost once a month. And this is an incredible work rate. If you think about his duties he had to perform, in Japan. And these active diplomatic engagements helped him develop a network of personal connections, not just with his counterparts abroad, but with prominent leaders in the areas outside politics. It also broadened his scope as an international leader. And in fact, I think his strong belief in the power of engagement was a source of inspiration for some of his policy initiatives, including the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, FOIP. Well, the FOIP, as you know, is a great strategic vision to create a community of nations sharing values and principles, but it is also designed as an action plan because it is underpinned by practical cooperation based on greater mutual engagement among participants in the areas like trade or maritime security. Anyway, by the time he hosted the G20 meeting in Osaka, he truly was a senior statesman on the world stage. As Tajima-san said, I served as Sherpa for that meeting. But the final stage of coordinating for the leader's statement was incredibly difficult. Not because of China or Russia, but because of the Atlantic divide. on the issues like climate change or trade. Remember, this was during Trump years. So as the leaders studied discussion of the plenary, I had to run the parallel process of negotiations for the leaders' statement among the Sherpas. But even after 2 sleepless nights, no breakthrough was in sight on the question of climate change. So on the early morning of the final day, I finally accepted the impossibility of a compromise. So I went to see Abe-san before the plenary session started and explained the situation. And I suggested we would take the sort of cop-out option of issuing chair's statement on that particular issue instead of making it part of the agreed document. But Abe-san had none of it. So from my briefing, he went straight to the plenary room and started talking to the other leaders like President Trump and President Macron. And voila, out of this conversation, a compromise emerged and we could adopt the final statement. So the episode shows you how confident he was toward the end of his premiership. He knew he could get things done even when so-called experts like myself were saying otherwise, drawing on his personal connections with other leaders. And this was possible because he was a great engager. The second Abe-san characteristic that impressed me was his pragmatism. He was, as you know, on the conservative side of the political spectrum in Japan, and he also had a very strong view on certain issues. But he was no ideologue. He aimed high, pursuing his political agenda. But he always had an uncanny ability to understand how far he could go politically. He never forgot that politics is the art of the possible, as Bismarck famously said. The security policy reform was a case in point. He brought the reform far enough to allow us to take measures necessary to respond to the emerging security challenges, but not so far as to completely alienate the still predominantly peace-oriented public opinion in Japan. The 2015 Comfort Women Agreement with ROK was another example of his pragmatism. Similarly, he was known to be a hardliner on China, but that didn't prevent him from making very efficient diplomatic efforts to bring the bilateral relations back on a normal track, and he succeeded with his official visit to Beijing in October 2018. The third and final point I want to make about his personality was deep sense of history. To me, it always seemed that he felt he owed it, not just to the Japanese public, but to history, to do his job to the best of his ability. I was Director General for North America Affairs between 2012 and 2015, and this coincided with a very sensitive period of historical reflection, as 2015 marked the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. And there were several defining occasions, the most important of which was the issuing of the official statement on the anniversary in August 2015. But also significant was the speech he delivered at the joint session of the U.S. Congress few months earlier than the issuing official statement. And working with Abe-san during this period, I was deeply impressed with the amount of attention he paid to the process of working out the appropriate messages. He was absolutely determined to make them right, because I suspect he knew his words would become part of history. And he did make them right, because in 2016, the following year, President Obama made a historic visit to Hiroshima as if to build on Abe-san's efforts. So the process of historical reflection was completed by Abe-san's subsequent visit to Pearl Harbor. But the way he managed the whole process, I think, was masterly. And I actually rank his role in that process among the most important contributions to our alliance, up there with the security policy reform and TPP. And I'm not forgetting about the grant program he created for the Japan study programs, which benefited Georgetown as well. But that process really impressed me. There were other political leaders who had a deep sense of history. Churchill had one, and it helped him motivate the British people during World War II, reminding them of the country's glorious past. Thatcher had also one, and her admiration for the old Methodist values were the main driver for her reform efforts. But I think in the case of Abe-san, the sense of history brought out humility, modesty, and dedication to his duty. On the eve of Abe-san's speech at the U.S. Congress, I was working late, running up and down narrow stairways in Blair House. And passing by the Prime Minister's suite room, I noticed a very loud voice coming out of it. And I wondered who was making such noise at that late hour. Then I realized it was Abe-san rehearsing his speech. Can you imagine someone in his position doing something like that? But that shows you how seriously he took his job and his place in history. So, given his devotion to history, it seemed all the more tragic that his life was cut short so abruptly. He would not be able to see the world he tried to shape. And it is a tremendous loss for us too, because he could still do so much in helping us respond to the uncertainties now unfolding in the world. When I wrote a book about Thatcher, I quoted a concluding part of the eulogy she delivered at the funeral of President Ronald Reagan. I'd like to conclude my remarks by reciting it, because I think it would also make a very apt epitaph for the late Prime Minister. We here still move in twilight, but we have one beacon to guide us that Ronald Reagan never had. We have his example. Let us give thanks today for life that achieved so much for all of God's children. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those poignant words, Ambassador. So we will now turn to a recording by Professor Michael Green.
Hi, I'm pleased to be joining you for this remembrance of former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo from here in Sydney, Australia, in the eastern suburbs. I'm here at the University of Sydney. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm really very pleased that Georgetown is taking stock of the important legacy of former Prime Minister Abe for Japan, for the U.S. Japan Alliance, for the world, and for Georgetown as well, as I'll note in a moment. I worked with Abe Shinzo in government. I studied him as a scholar. I considered him a friend, even as he became one of the most important political figures in Japan's modern history. While I was working in the White House in the Bush administration, Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro introduced Abe-san to President Bush at their first summit at Camp David in Maryland in June 2001. And he said that Abe, who was then the Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary and fairly young, would be Prime Minister soon. And I was ordered by the President and by Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, to keep good contact with Abe-san, which I did. He was in the role of Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary. I was a director and then the Senior Director for Asia at the NSC, and spoke with him in person and on telephone. So did Victor Cha and others on our staff, and dealt with some tough issues. We had to deal with North Korea's nuclear diplomacy. We had to deal with Taiwan contingencies and Taiwan challenges in world organizations like the World Health Organization. I had to deliver bad news. We, the Bush administration, slapped steel tariffs on some of our closest allies in 2002 before the midterm elections, which the foreign policy experts didn't agree with, but was seen as important politically. And I was given the unenviable task of calling Abe-san and telling him, sorry, but we're going to be hitting you with steel tariffs. And Abe-san dealt with all of this gracefully. We spoke in Japanese. He was always candid. He was always direct. When he said he was going to do something, he did it. When I left the White House in 2006 to come to Georgetown to teach, the President Bush asked me in my exit interview with him to keep in close touch with Abe-san, as it was evident at that point that Abe would soon replace Koizumi as the Prime Minister. And in particular, the President and I were interested in Abe-san's thinking on a range of issues. There were some in Washington who were concerned Abe-san was a bit spicy. You know, he had strong views on some historical issues, but there was also a feeling that this was a potentially very successful Prime Minister, and certainly one committed to Japan playing an active role in international affairs and strengthening the alliance with the United States. So I had a number of dinners and meetings with Abe-san as he was moving into the Prime Minister's position, including when he was Prime Minister. He was always very gracious, very thoughtful, very strategic. When he lost power in 2007, I sent him a note sort of quoting the famous Theodore Roosevelt line about being in the arena. I sent him Richard Nixon's biography of leaders, which Nixon wrote after he had lost an election in 1960 to John F. Kennedy. And Abe-san, like Nixon and like Winston Churchill in his wilderness years, didn't just sulk in the background. He studied. He called together bureaucrats. He called together experts, including from the United States. I was in several of those study groups that Abe-san had on grand strategy. There was not any sense in 2008-9 that Abe-san would come back, but he was preparing and thinking and studying, and he was a very loyal friend. I received a call from him on my wedding night wishing me luck. When my father passed away, I received a very warm note from Abe-san talking about what he knew of my father and my own discussions. He had that very warm personal touch that I think explains why so many world leaders not only eulogize the loss of an important counterpart, an important world figure, but a real dear friend. People like Narendra Modi in India, Tony Abbott in Australia. And you saw in the state funeral world leaders who knew Abe-san coming and marking the passage not only of a transformational person in Japan's politics and foreign policy, but a dear and close personal friend. And while I can't perhaps claim quite the same level of friendship and intimacy, I certainly benefited from Abe-san's warm personal connection to the United States, to me, to my family, and to Georgetown. Abe-san, in my conversations with him, was effusive in his praise of our wonderful university and of the School of Foreign Service. He said his favorite professors included Victor Cha, Kevin Doak, He felt that at Georgetown we were historians and scholars, but we cared about the world before us, and he admired that. And Abe-san is one of the reasons why Georgetown received from the Japanese government funds for an endowed chair in Japan studies, together with Columbia University, MIT, and the University of Toronto. Because Abe-san and his government wanted to invest in an institution that was committed to really understanding Japan in a regional context and bilaterally over the long term, which I think we have done faithfully, as have our counterparts at those other great universities. I published a book about Abe-san in March called Line of Advantage, which is a historical, strategic, political science look at the strategy, the grand strategy that Abe Shinzo consolidated for Japan. I noted in the book that the ideas behind Abe's strategy did not begin with him. In fact, that was one of the reasons I argued why they will last well beyond him, because it was Abe who pulled together some traditions in Japanese strategic thinking, borrowed some traditions in American strategic thinking, purpose-built them to deal with a dramatically new strategic environment. He did a number of things that really transformed Japan's position in the world at a time of intensifying geopolitical competition and questions about Japan's leadership. Abe-san came to the United States for the second time after his remarkable comeback as prime minister. As I said, several of us who knew him participated in study groups, met with him as he studied geopolitics and world affairs, very much the way Richard Nixon did after he lost his election, or Winston Churchill while he was in the wilderness before the famous return of power in 1940. And we studied and we joined him, but most of us didn't really think he'd come back. But he did. He did because Abe-san was the person the LDP, the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, thought it needed to push back against coercion and pressure from China to reassure the United States after a period of 6 years when Japan had a new prime minister every year, and when faith in Japan as an actor in international affairs was receding. And Abe had the vision and the ambition and the confidence of the LDP to be their candidate. And in 2012, he won for the party and came back and visited the United States, actually late 2011, came back to the United States in early 2012 for his first summit. He gave a speech at CSIS. I was the MC for the speech. And he picked up on a report a number of us had written the year before, which asked whether Japan was really going to be a tier one country. Of course, those of us who wrote it hoped the answer was yes. So Abe-san looked at us and he said, Japan is not now and will never be a tier two country. And that was what animated and mobilized and informed his strategic thinking. He, in political science terms, was getting Japan back in the game at a time of questioning of American resolve, and more significantly from his perspective, questioning about China's future and how China might use coercive tools, use its economic strength to pressure countries like Japan and in the region to create essentially hegemony, which is what Abe-san worried about. And Abe, like most Japanese leaders and like most leaders in the region, did not want a Chinese hegemonic system, but did want a relationship with China, wanted to trade with China, wanted economic and diplomatic interaction with China. Abe-san from the beginning was seen as an anti-China hawk, which he was in a way, but as I argued in my book, he was interested in stabilizing Japan-China relations, reasserting Japan's agency, Japan's strength, so that China would deal with Japan as an equal, not as a subject of pressure and coercion. That was his long-term goal, not to contain China, not to completely decouple from China, certainly not a war with China or confrontation with China, but to get respect back from China. And he succeeded. Now, how did he do this? Well, in political science terms or international relations terms, when you're faced with a rising power, you have three options. You can bandwagon. Abe rejected that, and the Japanese people were with him. He said, Japan is not now and will never be a tier two power. Japan will be at least co-equal to China in Asia, and is not going to step back and cede regional leadership to China. He's even as powerful and as important as China has become. But how do you do that if you're Japan and you've slipped from, since Abe was first in power to his return, from being the number 2 economy in the world to the number 3 economy behind China? How do you do that? Well, international relations theorists would say you have several options. One is internal balancing, the production of more power, nuclear weapons in the extreme. Abe did increase the defense budget. He squeezed more out of Japan's economy, not as much as free market economists would have liked, but he certainly got more productivity and growth by empowering women more, by reforming the stock market, by reforming tourism, all of which added to growth. He organized Japan in what scholars call qualitative internal balancing, not quantitative, not increasing defense spending alone, but qualitative, organizing to compete. He created a National Security Council. I had conversations with him, Professor Victor Cha had conversations with him, others on how the American or Korean or British model worked. He created a very effective National Security Council. He produced Japan's first national security strategy, and he started building a top-down strategic guidance for the government, because when you have less to work with, you have to use it smarter. So that qualitative internal balancing was so critical to his legacy and continues to shape Japan's leadership today. And then, in addition to internal balancing, external balancing, Abe-san knew that Japan did not have enough inherent power alone to deal with the changing strategic environment. So he emphasized friends, partners, allies. The core of it was the United States. Even when Donald Trump was president, Abe-san, more than any other major world leader, cultivated a relationship. He got some criticism for it. Played golf with Donald Trump. You know, a colleague of mine said to a senior foreign ministry official, it's remarkable, you know, Prime Minister Abe's had over 20 summits with Donald Trump. The foreign ministry official replied, no, Abe-san has had the same summit 20 times, because Donald Trump would keep raising these issues about trade and about, you know, whether or not there should be troops in Korea, where his positions now are well known. And Abe would patiently talk it through with him. And the rest of the G7 leaders, the rest of the democratic world really admired how Abe became their Trump whisperer through that difficult time. But even before that, during the Obama administration, as Professor Medeiros would know, because he was on the job in the White House at the time, Abe negotiated with the United States new defense guidelines, and to enact those, a change in legislation in Japan and a change in how Japan interpreted Article 9 of the Constitution, the Peace Clause. And what he did was say that Japan has the right under the UN Charter, and therefore in its Constitution, to do something it has not done, which is exercise the right of collective self-defense, essentially to come to the aid of the United States, not just be defended by the United States. Now, this does not mean that Japanese troops will rescue Washington, D.C. or Maryland if the bad guys come. What it means is Japanese ships can resupply American ships. Japanese Aegis destroyers can defend American carrier battle groups if there is a threat to Japan that justifies Japan joining the coalition. For the first time, American and Japanese defense planners can plan together for contingencies. Japan's in. And it means that every Japanese prime minister now has to think about what Japan would do in a crisis, in a contingency. Japan is now no longer protected by an interpretation of constitutional prohibitions that was an alibi. They kept Japan from participating actively in the Gulf War, in the Vietnam War, you name it. But now Abe decided we've got to be in because we need the Americans to be in. And that means every Japanese prime minister, including the current one, Prime Minister Kishida, is going to be held accountable for what role they'll play in a crisis in a way that before Abe was not so clear. Massive institutional change. Controversial in Japan, but he convinced the public after over 100 hours of diet debate. The remarkable thing about this is Abe changed the way the rest of us approach China. The administration of Donald Trump announced a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy as its framework for the region. They got that directly from Abe's people. The Biden administration has embraced the same Indo-Pacific strategic approach and has built on things Abe championed as prime minister. The Quad, which began in response to the Indian Ocean tsunami when Victor Cha was in his first week at the NSC and got a baptism of bureaucratic fire. but grew in Abe's vision to being the summit. People poo-pooed that idea when he was prime minister in 2006 and 7. Now, the Trump and Biden administrations, India and Australia, have embraced the idea that these maritime democracies, Japan, the United States, India, and Australia, have a particular responsibility to safeguard the maritime commons and buttress stability in Asia. So these kinds of initiatives are why the Lowy Institute in Australia, which is not where I am, but a wonderful think tank down the road, declared in its annual assessment of Asian power in 2019 that at the end of Abe's term, Japan had become the leader of the free world, of the liberal order in the Indo-Pacific because of this thought leadership and this active diplomacy. There's some controversy around Abe-san's state funeral, as you've seen in the press. The changes he made in Japan's diplomacy and defense were big, and they will last. And there is a minority, but a vocal minority that wasn't happy about it. They're protesting. There's also protests because the tragic circumstances of Abe-san's murder, his assassination, have become known, and Yamagami, the frankly deranged individual who was the assassin, was trying to avenge his mother, who was trapped in the Unification Church cult. And it is true that the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, has long been connected to the Unification Church. I worked as a staffer in the LDP when I was a student at Tokyo University a long time ago in the late 1980s. It was very obvious in the LDP headquarters how much the Unification Church and other groups were necessary for the LDP's political machine. So that's an unpleasant reality of Japanese politics. Was Abe-san the architect of it? Was Abe-san personally involved? No. But that aspect of Japanese politics has been unearthed by this tragic killing, and people are not happy about it. So you see a bit of that, and you see those who opposed his amendments to the Constitution, pacifists, people on the left, coming out and protesting. But that should not detract from what you see from the rest of the world, which is a remarkable level of respect and a sense of loss for a world leader who defined, in my view, and as I will argue shortly, you'll see in a foreign affairs piece, who really defined how we compete with China, which is by strengthening alliances and partnerships, strengthening deterrence, but also investing in free trade agreements, which Abe-san did, investing in multilateralism, investing in engagement with China. And at the end of the day, although Chinese ambassadors compared Abe to Lord Voldemort from Harry Potter in opinion pieces in Britain when he first came to power, at the end of the day, the Chinese leadership respected what he was trying to do at a level that surprised even Abe's supporters. And that's a powerful strategic legacy for all the rest of us. Compete with China, build deterrence, build alliances and partnerships, but you also, United States of America, have to invest in diplomacy, multilateralism, trade, engagement, and a long-term relationship with China. This is not about containing China. And Abe-san, more than any world leader, has broken that code and shaped how all the rest of us are thinking about competition. So a huge historic legacy, a very good friend of Georgetown, and a big loss for Japan and the world. And I appreciate so much that the School of Foreign Service and Georgetown and my colleagues are taking time to have this tribute. I wish I could be with you, but it's lovely here in Sydney. We're heading into summer, and though I wish I could be with you, the Bondi Beach isn't far away. So I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.
Victor?
Sure. Well, thanks, Yuki, and thanks to you for creating this new lecture series. It's a wonderful tribute to Prime Minister Abe, and thank you, Ambassador Tomita, for taking the time out of your schedule to join us today, and my good friend Sheila Smith and Mike. Of course, it's great to be with you all. I'll start with my own personal story about Prime Minister Abe. Was my first meeting with him was in early 2005. He was either Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary or Chief Cabinet Secretary at the time. And Mike and Dennis were like, I was in Korea and Japan, and they say, you have to meet him and get to know him. So we planned a private dinner, just the two of us, on my first night from traveling from Korea. So I was in Korea doing meetings with Blue House and Foreign Ministry officials. And then I had a steak dinner at the Chosun Hotel. And the next morning, I was deathly ill. It must have been just bad meat. It wasn't U.S. beef, but it must have been just bad meat. And I spent the entire day at the Okra Hotel on the hotel room floor. I was so sick and had to pull myself up. I canceled all my meals. I had to pull myself up for dinner with Shinzo Abe, and he took me to one of the best sushi places in Tokyo, and it was like a 17-course meal, and I could barely touch any of the food. I was drinking tea and a grain of rice here and like a piece of sushi there. And we were talking issues, and finally, he was incredibly gracious and polite. Halfway through the meal, like on like the 8th course, we're talking, and he stops and he goes, "Dr. Cha, I'm sorry, I did not. Nobody told me that you didn't like Japanese food." And I said, "No, Prime Minister Abe. Chief Cabinet Secretary Abe. I love Japanese food. It's just that I've got some problems today." And so then he was like, "Oh, can you bring some porridge or something?" So he's just incredibly gracious, incredibly wonderful person. I'll never forget that meeting. When he became Prime Minister, Mike had left the White House. It was myself and Dennis Wilder at the time. We worked with Prime Minister Abe through a very difficult year, 2006, 2007. Just a very difficult year for him physically, a very difficult year for him politically. There was the big postal savings scandal at the time. And then when he left office, when he resigned and left office, I don't think that there was anybody in the Japanese government, in the expert community, in the LDP, in Japanese politics that thought he would come back. I think everybody thought that he was done. An incredible family in Japanese politics, but that this was it. And so his resurgence, if you will, to become this incredibly consequential figure in both Japanese politics and in international affairs was nothing short of a miracle. I mean, I shouldn't say a miracle because it was through his own leadership and his own hard work, but it was just something that no one ever expected. And of course, for the better of both U.S. Japan relations and the affairs in Asia overall. I always found him to be extremely knowledgeable. He would have what I would call a working level bureaucrat's knowledge of the issues, and that's not an insult, that's a compliment for somebody at such a high level politically to be able to engage in minutia of detail on any particular issues. As Ambassador said, he studied incredibly hard, and I've heard that story about his practicing his speech before the Congress as well. It was really a reflection of how hard he worked and really how much he knew about the issues. So you never felt uncomfortable engaging with him on very complicated and difficult issues. Some of you know I do some work on North Korea. On North Korea, Shinzo Abe is a hawk. Was a hawk, is a hawk, will always be a hawk on North Korea. Very tough on North Korea, perceived a real threat, existential threat from North Korea's ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons to Japan and Japanese security. Made even more real over the last week with the flying of a ballistic missile over the archipelago of Japan. He was a champion of the abductees issue in Japan, and really the abduction of Japanese citizens by the North Koreans in the 1970s, and really turned it into a global issue in the sense that it was something that people really didn't know a lot about until the early 2000s, and really took it upon himself to make it a global issue. And in many ways was the precursor to the broader discussion, the broader global discussion of human rights abuses in North Korea. So in that sense, he was also tough. At the same time that he was tough on North Korea, he was always ready to engage. And towards the end of his prime ministership, he was willing to engage almost unconditionally with North Korea to try to see if there's any way to make inroads into creating diplomacy that could lead to denuclearization. So tough, but at the same time willing to engage. As Ambassador Tomita, as Mike has said, I think he'll be most remembered internationally for his values-based diplomacy in his second term in office, the focus on democracy, the focus on freedom. In many ways, he anticipated what we're dealing with today in terms of the threat to the liberal international order. As has already been said, the Quad, as we know it today, was originally an idea that came out of an emergency disaster response effort in Christmas of 2004. And that idea really animated his view of bringing the democracies of Asia together to support the liberal international order. And while he was prime minister first in 2006, he toyed with the idea, but there was just not enough support broadly in the region, and in terms of his own domestic politics, not enough room. But he talked about it quite a bit when he was out of government, and then of course it's back today as one of the most important new groupings in Asia. And then, as has already been said, the free and open Indo-Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific as we know it today, our first discussion of these ideas was during when he was prime minister in 2006. That's where we started hearing of this term, free and open Indo-Pacific. And so the idea, I don't think Mike is exaggerating when he says the notion that the Trump administration took this idea directly from the Japanese is not incorrect. I think that's very much the case. So I think in many ways where we are today in terms of bringing democracies together in these coalitional groupings to deal with economic threats and security threats to values was something that Prime Minister Abe really did anticipate and show concern about during his prime ministership, even as far back as 2006. And then on South Korea, I think he too also had a very I think it was in his DNA to believe that a strong relationship with South Korea and trilateral relations among the three allies in Asia was very important. He did have some difficult periods with South Korean governments, but at the same time, to my surprise, in 2015, negotiated the Comfort Women Agreement with the Park government in South Korea. It was a surprise to me because there were lots of rumors about what Prime Minister Abe's views were on the Kono apology, and lots of concerns that there might be revision to that. But in the end, he went in the opposite direction, which was to negotiate this agreement. An agreement that, for someone who studied this issue very carefully, I was very surprised at the agreement because, I would say it probably gave the South Koreans 80% of what they wanted. And as everybody on this stage knows, in any government negotiation, you never get 80%. You get maybe 40%, and it feels like 10%, right? And yet that agreement was negotiated. And then finally, I'd say that he really sort of transformed Japan into an important and significant participant in East Asia, into a leader in ways that I think many people didn't anticipate. Part of it was because the United States, frankly, recessed from leadership during the Trump years, and Japan stepped up, particularly in terms of bringing CPTPP together, and a number of other things. But also, he was, and I'm searching for the right adjective, he was proactive, willing to take risks on the very sensitive issue of history and Japan's history in the region in 2015. Scholars could argue, but part of that was externally determined in the sense that it was the 70th anniversary, and so that might have compelled any Japanese leader to be more proactive on history. But Prime Minister Abe, given the way people thought of him on the history issue, really took some risks on this. And whether it was with the United States, in terms of the speech at Congress, the visit to Pearl Harbor, the visit to Hiroshima, whether it was in Australia, in the Australian Parliament, and his statements there, or whether it was the Comfort Woman Agreement with South Korea. These are not easy things for a political leader to undertake. And so there's some who still, I'm sure, don't feel satisfied by what he did. We have to acknowledge that these were very significant and politically significant steps that, again, regardless of how you feel about it, you cannot say anything else but that it was leadership to take on those very difficult tasks. So with that, let me finish and I guess turn it to Sheila. So, okay.
Thank you, Victor. And again, let me also thank you, Yuhki, for bringing us here together and for this new memorial lecture series that we're all going to be able to enjoy. And thank you, Ambassador Tomita, for joining us in celebrating the accomplishments and the life of Abe Shinzo. As some of you may know, some of you I see are in my class, my students. I'm delighted to see you here. My job today is to contextualize Abe at home, to talk to you a little bit about the domestic political context within which Abe Shinzo had to operate in order to do all of what we have heard described today. Let me start with a personal reflection. My job as a scholar was to study Abe. I didn't have the opportunity, obviously, to work in government with him, but I did have a lovely conversation with him in the process of doing research. And this is a book that I wrote about called Intimate Rivals, which is about Japanese domestic politics and the response to a rising China. And this is the moment when Abe was out of office. He was studying economics. He was doing all the things that Mike and Victor described. And I thought, oh, I really can't approach him on this, can I? Because I really wanted to ask him about his 2006 to 2007 period in office, how he became the leader of the party and his thoughts on China. But I talked to friends and they said, no, he'd love to talk to you about that. And I said, all right. So I formally asked for the interview. And it was one of the highlights of my research for the book. It was a very thoughtful and honest appraisal of his own behavior, his cabinet's behavior, and also what he was trying to do as he was trying to shape Japanese behavior. But it was remarkable. He was very personable. He was very straightforward. And very self-reflective, I think, of his own abilities in that interview. I didn't publish all of it in the book, so don't go looking at it in the book. But he spent what was nominally a 30-minute interview with a scholar from the United States. He spent almost 2.5 hours with me and moved appointments around so he could really make sure that I understood what he was trying to say. And this, again, speaks to the Abe that really does believe that American scholars in particular, but all scholars really, need to understand Japan's relationship with China, but also Japan's, what needed to change in that relationship with China. The other hat that I wear, and Yuhki kindly introduced it at the beginning, is I'm the chair of the U.S. panel of the Kokan, which is a commission of Japanese and American individuals who try to help promote people-to-people exchange. Student study abroad, the kinds of things that hopefully will help support you in your careers going forward in the U.S. Japan partnership. And here, Prime Minister Abe, by this time he is back in office as Prime Minister, was an adamant advocate for the work that we were doing. He showed up at every meeting we had, at every announcement of initiatives we were trying to put forward. And he took our ideas and task force reports and embedded them in his cabinet's educational reforms. So he was an advocate for making sure that young people like yourselves had the opportunity to study abroad, that you had the opportunity to have the support not only of governments, but of people like us outside of government encouraging you to build this partnership and expand this partnership. So that's my personal interaction with the former Prime Minister. And of course, like everyone else here on July 8th, I was deeply shocked at the assassination. Let me put my political science hat in addition to my researcher hat on and give you a couple of points that I think important to recognize and to bring you into the domestic politics within which former Prime Minister Abe had to operate. We all know, and we've heard it, that as we discussed in our class on domestic politics, Mr. Abe was a legacy politician, and that means he came from a very distinguished political family. His grandfather, well known, it was Prime Minister Kishi Nobusuke, and many people, especially in Japan, make a great deal about the ideology of Kishi Nobusuke and how Abe had affinity with those ideas. But he was also, his great uncle was the prime minister that followed Kishi, Sato Eisaku. He watched his family run Japan in some very difficult moments in the late 50s and 1960s. But I think the influence that he spoke to me about, but also that many people around him felt was the strongest, was in fact his father, Abe Shintaro. And Abe Shintaro served as Japan's foreign minister. He was also a very strong leader within the Conservative Party, the Liberal Democratic Party. But it's as Abe Shintaro's political secretary that Abe Shinzo really cut his teeth, so to speak, on politics. It's how he learned to be a representative of Yamaguchi Prefecture, the ins and outs of what it means to be elected and go into office. But he also learned what everybody here has emphasized about Abe, former Prime Minister Abe, and that is this idea that you engage in foreign policy. You don't just have ideas and tell others to implement them, but you become, in fact, the agent of trying to create the relationships that you're trying to build abroad. So I think it's an important piece of reflection about him, that it was not his great uncle or his grandfather's photograph, but his father's photograph that sat on his desk when he was Prime Minister of Japan. He served, as you know, 2 terms as Prime Minister, one very abbreviated and a lot shorter than most people expected of him, 2006 to 2007. He was then lauded to be the youngest Prime Minister in post-war Japan. He was born in the post-war period, the first Prime Minister that young. His time in office ended abruptly, largely due to health reasons, but also due to some scandals and confusion within his cabinet. But one piece of that learning for Prime Minister Abe that came back to him as he returned to office was his medication. The medication he needed for a chronic health condition was not available in Japan due to over-regulation of the Japanese pharmaceutical market. When he came back in 2012, that was one of the first reforms he made, was to make sure that Japanese had access to the globally competitive medical products that should be available. So he's somebody who sees a problem and fixes it, even though it's a very personal problem to him. It was something that he felt that the Japanese people needed a lot more responsiveness and more access to the technology and science and accomplishments of the global market. He's 8 years in office, you all know, he was the longest serving prime minister. He was very effective in Abenomics and the security reforms that other speakers have noted, as well as Japanese strategic and foreign policies. But I think that interval in between, and Mike alluded to this in his comments, is also an important piece of the puzzle to understand. Economic policy making was not Prime Minister Abe's forte in his first time in office, and he took that to heart. And again, Mike mentioned this as well. He really wanted to make sure that he understood the economy and he was capable of making good economic decisions. And that was a real accomplishment by the time you see him back in office in 2012. But what also happened in Japanese politics during this period that Abe-san was preparing himself to return was, of course, Japan experimented with a new party in power. The LDP was defeated in an election in 2009. The Democratic Party of Japan then came into office for a very tumultuous 3 years. That is the backdrop against which the LDP then went to election in late 2012 after a snap dissolution of the parliament. But Abe-san was not responsible, of course, for all of this. But as he watched the DPJ and as he thought carefully about his own sense of this rising China, I think it was very clear to him that the stability in governance inside Japan was the key prerequisite for Japan to be able to cope with this growing strategic challenge outside the country. And so Abe-san himself, and he spoke to me a little bit about this in our interview, but Abe-san himself began to understand that strong governance at home was not simply to the benefit of Japanese citizens, but was also going to be Japan's greatest strategic asset going forward. And he used that language when he was campaigning for the LDP's presidency in 2012, and then later on when the general election, the lower house election, was being held. That presidency, that election for the presidency, by the way, Abe-san was one of the few, there were 4 contenders, and he basically came out very strongly on the issue of the Senkaku Islands. And he came out strongly by repeating an argument his father had made back in the 1970s, and that is Japan perhaps made a mistake by not putting officials on the islands, by not putting Japanese citizens on those islands, because under international law, that would have been a very clear indication of Japanese administrative control. And so this was a startling argument to make in the politics of 2012, but at the end of the day, it was a very clear signal that he thought the status quo around these islands was changing, and that Japanese policy also had to accommodate these changes in new ways. He was overwhelmingly elected as the leader of the party, and then obviously the LDP came back with an overwhelming victory. Not necessarily because of that issue, but I think it shows what others here have emphasized, which is Abe-san was thinking carefully about this changing equilibrium outside the country, but also about taking risks. And that was a risky political position to take in 2012. But nonetheless, he didn't shy away from putting his opinion forward. Let me say a few words now about the LDP's comeback and Abe's comeback in 2012, just to give you a sense of how Abe-san managed his political foundation throughout those 8 years in office. I remember the CSIS speech that Mike and Victor both attended. I was there too. And he was very confident in saying, Japan is back, and I am back. And also the LDP was back. And so there's a combination there, I think, of the domestic political thinking within the party that Abe-san led that was also important to appreciate. The 2/3 majority was the outcome of that 2012 lower house election. Now, I know many of you are familiar with parliamentary politics. A 2/3 majority is a firm legislative foundation for a policy agenda. With 2/3 of the seats in the lower house of parliament, Abe-san could go on to accomplish many of the difficult policies and somewhat controversial policies that he set forth for Japan. He also, in close consultation with leaders of the LDP, made sure that that 2/3 majority was maintained. There were 5 elections during those 8 years, including the initial 2012. 2 of those subsequent lower house elections ensured that that 2/3 majority for the LDP continued to hold. And again, it's the LDP and a small coalition party, but for the government, that allowed them to be confident that proposals put forward in the parliament would succeed in becoming law. And that was absolutely critical in 2015, when after reinterpreting the Article 9 for the right of collective self-defense that Mike mentioned, that allowed then for the revision and the reform of Japan's security laws to allow the kind of participation that Abe-san envisioned for the self-defenses with the United States and with other national militaries around the region. So that foundation at home was also something that the former Prime Minister Abe and his party paid particular attention to ensure that the agenda, the legislative foundation for his reforms would be in place. Now, there was another issue very close to former Prime Minister Abe's heart, and that was constitutional revision. He did not accomplish that during his time in office, but the electoral strategy that the LDP and Abe-san put forward also included improving the LDP's position in the upper house. Under the Japanese constitution, you need a 2/3 majority in both houses of parliament to come together to put forward ideas for revision that would then face a national referendum. And so he also had his eye on that. So that is the foundation, I think, that made a lot of what Abe-san was trying to do in that transformation of Japan's preparedness and Japan's economy and Japan's sort of social resilience, if you will. That was the foundation that he thought most important. I think that's also the foundation, Victor's comment here about the 2015 70th anniversary, that was the foundation also he worked with for the relationship with South Korea that then made the Comfort Women Agreement possible. Now, there's no great leader without controversy, and so we would be remiss if we didn't mention that his 8 years in office was also accompanied by controversy. The issues that he cared deeply about, Article 9, the Constitution, the revision agenda as well, some of his investments in Japanese thinking about their military, of course, also created some backlash within the country. As many of you know, Japan is deeply committed to Article 9 of the Constitution. But Japanese people were also beginning to sense that the neighborhood within which they lived was becoming more, if not threatening, at least uneasy. And the conflict with China in 2010 to 2012 over the Senkaku Islands, the territorial dispute, brought that to a head. So if you look at some of the public opinion polling of that time, you'll see very clearly that the Japanese public is beginning to get somewhat anxious about whether or not Japan is well prepared to cope not just with China, but with a nuclear, increasingly competent and potentially nuclear North Korea, and also to maintain its status as a global economic power. But Abe-san, these are issues that drew a lot of controversy. In 2015, when this legislation over the new security laws was passing the Diet, tens of thousands of Japanese took to the streets. The placards at the time said, "Say no to Abe's war bills," so it revealed a sense, still that deep sense of pacifism within Japan and the concern over Japanese military power and how it would wield that power. It didn't actually, Abe-san was unable even within his own party to push forward the agenda for constitutional revision. There are many points of view on whether or not the Constitution should be revised. Some in his party wanted to go much further on revising Article 9 than Abe-san was prepared to go. So again, he had to manage the political influence there within the party on that issue. And even as we've mentioned on some of these more delicate issues of war memory and his own statements in the past, Abe-san was very aware that his point of view was not the consensus position on some of these issues. To be sure, on the Yasukuni Shrine, he felt quite strongly that prime ministers should be able to visit that to honor Japan's war dead, but he didn't go until December of 2013. He went once. Again, to much controversy at home. His Abe statement in 2015 on the 70th anniversary of the war, Victor alluded to, he created a study group. He understood that this is something he needed to speak on, but he wanted to get feedback on how this would not only reverberate inside Japan, but would reverberate outside Japan. So he was quite pragmatic in making sure that he had the advice he needed to influence not only his own views, but also how he asserted those views in public. Finally, he had a great deal of political influence. He knew how to wield political influence. Not only on the issues he cared about, but on the issues that the Japanese people cared about. He wanted to make sure the prime minister's office was in charge, and he exercised influence over civil servant promotions, over other kinds of issues where in the past there might have been a little bit more diffuse power within the Japanese bureaucracy. There were several influence scandals during his time, the Moritomo Gakuen and others, where bureaucrats and others acting in his name were seen to have taken liberties with the law in some cases, but no, Abe-san himself was never directly attached to that. I think a long tenure in office has both its accomplishments and also a sense of concern over whether or not influence is being properly executed. He was never, ever accused of anything directly. I think there was more of a sense in the Japanese system that others anticipated what Mr. Abe may want and acted in ways that others thought were problematic. At the end of the day, he was an astonishing example of how to mobilize not only the Japanese bureaucracy, but also to mobilize critics inside Japan to think about Japan's future and Japan's role in the world and in terms of the next generation more effectively. Let me conclude with what I think is one of the questions that is perhaps most difficult to answer. and that is what is going to be the Abe legacy on Japanese politics and policy. You know, Prime Minister Abe was the leader of the largest faction within the LDP. He was poised in many ways to be the kingmaker, to be the deciding voice on who was going to lead the party and therefore probably who was going to lead the country. And I think that was a very critical role that many of us saw him in. Another was he was going to be able to say things that were problematic. Some people may feel they were ideological, but he was going to be able to say things to rattle the debate in Japan. In the midst of the discussion over Putin's invasion of Ukraine, former Prime Minister Abe started talking about, well, maybe Japan should talk about nuclear sharing. Maybe Japan should talk about this issue of what kind of deterrent Japan may need in this new era. He would have been the person that would have been able to say these with respect, but also to stimulate debate where others may have shied away. And finally, and as everybody here has said, and said quite eloquently, and I'll be brief, he was the voice of a strong Japan on the global stage. And that is a voice that is hard to replicate. That is a voice that comes not only from his personal convictions, and I think you've heard about them from all of us, but it also comes from his confidence in representing Japan abroad, his understanding that Japan needed a strong voice and an articulation of its interests abroad, not only for Japan's own future, but in shaping the institutions that Japan has experienced overseas in the international world that we've all come to acknowledge as the liberal international order. So in honor of Abe Shinzo, then, I just would like to say that he is somebody that we all enjoyed listening to. We didn't always understand exactly where he was coming from on some things, but he was someone for generations now, I think, will be a model for future Japanese leaders in how they not only speak to the events outside the country, but how they understand the absolute imperative of strong domestic political foundations for their leadership. Thank you.
Great. So we do have 2 mics here for questions and answers. So if you guys want to line up, please do so. And if you have a question, please tell us your name and your program or affiliation. And please keep your questions concise and in the form of a question. Thank you. We'll start on the left side here.
Thanks for being here, Mr. Okay. I'm Jinu Lee. I'm the first year Master's in Foreign Service students. I'm from Korea. I have a question regarding on trilateral relationship with U.S., Korea, and Japan. Since the new current administration of South Korea is trying to restore the trilateral cooperation, so how can 3 countries strengthen their cooperation in order to achieve the free and open Indo-Pacific? And also, is there any chance to expand the Quad, including Korea or New Zealand, or establishing a new security cooperative initiative? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Shall we answer?
Yeah, why don't we just take really a couple minutes each. Yeah,
I'll happy to do.
We'll yeah.
It's a great question. The bilateral relation between Japan and Korea had been very difficult. I was a part of the efforts to patch it up, and I was an ambassador previously in Seoul. But even during the difficult times, difficult period for bilateral political questions, I think both countries, Japan and Korea, have been try to prevent this difficulty from spilling over to the security cooperation. Not always successful in that, but the trilateral collaboration has always been a very important focus of the 3 countries, particularly in the context of North Korea. And with the change, the government in ROK, I think there's a brighter prospect for making the trilateral cooperation even stronger. And of course, it's important to make progress in improving our bilateral relations, and we are making progress. And so, on the whole, I'm very much upbeat about prospect. And in terms of the question about the Quad, bringing in other members like Korea and New Zealand, I think the current feeling among the participants is the Quad itself is now we are in the process of consolidating the framework. We just agreed to upgrade our process to the leaders level quite recently. So we haven't really started about bringing in other members as well. But the important thing is the Quad is a very open process, and there's ways to engage the members. So I think I'm looking forward to strengthening this practical cooperation, engaging other members. The question of membership is not on the is not a front burner issue for the members for the time being.
Why don't we take a couple of questions, so one over here and one over here, and if we have extra time, we can go back.
Okay, thank you all for this panel today. It was extremely informative, and I'm Yenhan Chen. I am a sophomore in the School of Foreign Service. I'm from Taiwan. As we know, Japan and Taiwan have been long-time regional partners in many ways, such as trade and defense. So as Chinese economic and military coercion against Taiwan gradually shifts to gray zone coercion, and this is, of course, something Japan has also experienced in the past. How will Japan continue to support democratic institutions in the region against newer forms of, for example, gray zone coercion?
Thank you. My name is Taiju Sasaki, and I'm a second-year MSF student. I have a question regarding the future direction of Japan's national security strategy. So in the first national security strategy, which was published under Prime Minister Abe's leadership, it positioned Russia and China as some sort of strategic partners rather than competitors or rivals. So I wonder what would be included in the new national security strategy under the Kishida administration, and I wonder if that would describe them as more of competitors rather than strategic partners. That would be my question. Thank you.
Well, all these questions are. First on Taiwan, we have increasing concern over the situation surrounding Taiwan. So we've been trying to make our message very clear. When Prime Minister Suga visited Washington, we said in the joint leaders statement that the importance of peace and stability in Taiwan, and emphasized the importance of peaceful resolution of cross-strait problems. And I think it was the first time for the leaders of two countries to state publicly such concern. So sending a very clear message is, I think, one of the most important things we should be doing at this juncture. And also, Japan has been emphasizing importance of strengthening deterrent and responsive capabilities. And the Prime Minister Kishida is now doing the comprehensive review of Japan's defense posture, defense policy, strategy, posture, and so on and so forth. And this will result in, I hope, more robust defense efforts. And this will strengthen our alliance. And I think that would be another way to ensure that we can maintain the peace and stability in that part. And of course, since the peace and stability in Taiwan, surrounding Taiwan is important, resilience of the Taiwanese society is also important. So we'll be supporting Taiwan in different ways. For instance, we provided the vaccines, for instance, last year when there was a controversy in Taiwan whether or not to accept Chinese vaccines. And also we will be supporting Taiwan's voice being heard nationally. For instance, your observership in the national organization, WHO, for instance. These things will be very important, and Japan will be fully behind such efforts. Turning to the national strategy, defense strategy, security strategy, I think, first of all, it's slightly premature for me to say something definite about, because we are still in the process of working out the new strategy. But my sense is that, first of all, we need to take into consideration the increasingly serious security environment surrounding us. But in terms of how we respond to this situation, I think Abe-san's reform, we talk about legislative reform. I think he created, policy legislative environment where we can effectively respond to the emerging security challenges. So what I think we are going to do is to improve our toolkits. First of all, I think we have to have enough budget to have, effective tools, how to employ. Maybe we are missing a few tools. For instance, in view of the emerging gap in terms of standoff capabilities, we need additional tools to respond to that situation. And of course, we need to have the capacity to sustain our efforts. So I think depth of certain defense assets will be very important. So I think improving toolkits will be the main focus of us, the new strategy. But that's just my own sense. So I'm looking forward to what sort of outcome will be produced on the basis of this review.
Great. Well, it looks like we are actually over time now, so please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists for this very engaging talk. Ambassador, thank you so much.